Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at debugging in our NetBeans environment. This video assumes that you have already watched the introductory video for our debug demo project. This video is part of a larger series focusing on interesting problems related to debugging. And in this particular case, what we want to do is we want to see how can we handle command line arguments in our NetBeans environment when we are debugging. We already know how to handle them from the command line when we are running our application from the command line. But what we want to do in this video is we want to focus on how to set up our debugger and pass those command line arguments to our debugging instance of our executable. So to begin with, this video assumes that you've watched the earlier video on command line arguments as well as the earlier video on the debugging demo and the setup of the debugger. So let's get started. We'll take a copy of our debug arg_01 snips file. We want to go ahead and bring over our function prototypes as well as our start of our function implementation. And at this point, what we want to do is go ahead and set up some of our logic in our main, just like we would have in an earlier video. And so what we're actually going to do is we're going to attempt to handle the cliffhanger, if you would, that we left you with in our earlier video, where we just stuck our setup NetBeans into the first branch of our if, else, if, else. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to do a better job of handling these switches. So to begin with, what I want to do is I want to set up another else if, and once again, I'm going to use my string compare I, and I'm simply going to compare my argv square brackets 1. And what we'll do is we'll handle both the debug argv_1 demo, but also the previous demo. So we can see how to do both. In this case, it's going to be setup_NetBeans. And if those two values match, then we assume then that the user intended to call our setup NetBeans function. Now, we'll come back and we'll clean up the rest of this in a little bit, but what we want to do is we want to go ahead and handle the second scenario here. In other words, with a string compare I, we're going to compare our argv square brackets 1, and we're simply going to compare it to the debug _argv_01. And if those two match, we once again simply want to make a call to our debug argv_01. However, there is a slight difference with this one. And if you notice, the function signature is in fact not void. And also you'll notice that I am returning an integer value. And specifically, the input arguments are argc, which is the same as your argc from your main, as well as the argv. And so the idea here is I want to simply pass through my argc and my argv to this function that we plan to debug. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and create another temporary variable that we're simply going to call results. And at this point, I simply want to capture my results. And I'm going to go ahead and print my results to the console, and we'll discuss what those results will be in just a second. And using a %d for the placeholder, I'm simply going to print out whatever the value was that is returned by our function. So let's get to our function itself. So let's right-click on the function, go to Navigate, go to Declaration and Definition. And what we want to do in this particular video is we want to use this as a refresher for how our for loop works that allows for us to enumerate through all of the arguments in our argv. And so to begin with, what I want to do is I want to create a temporary variable called index, And remember now, since this is inside of this function, it has a different scope than the index variable associated with main. It also has a different memory address. And we also want to go ahead and return or capture the number of arguments. So I'm actually going to have a second variable that we will discover that we won't actually need, but I want to do this intentionally so that we can understand how these memory addresses are different. And the first thing I want to do is I simply want to set the value of argc to the results variable, and I simply want to return the results. So essentially what we're doing is returning the number of input arguments. Now, partially the purpose of this video is a little bit of practice at enumerating our command line arguments, but also understanding how you can use the debugger to discover the scope of your variable and how the addresses of each one of the variables are in fact different, despite the fact that the names are the same. And so what we want to do here is inside of our function, we'll simply leverage a for loop starting with 0, continuing up to our argc, and we want to increment our index. And then inside of here, we're simply going to print out the arguments. I'm going to intentionally put a couple of spaces in here just so that we can delineate between the first call and the second call. And I tell you what, I'm actually going to go ahead and make this into a nice little table, complete with a border before and after our for loop. Really, the whole goal is here, we want to just emphasize that this is our function printing out these values. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to simply print out my argv square brackets, and inside of there, the %d, in other words, the index is going to populate the %d, and that is simply going to be equal to %s. That's the format that I want to have. So in other words, I just want to simply print out the arguments in nice, clean format. And for that first placeholder, I'm going to insert the index value. And then for that second placeholder, I'm going to use argv square brackets index. At this point, we can go ahead and save it. It's probably worthwhile to go ahead and build it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come out first to the command line, and we are going to verify that our switches correctly work. Now, we're sort of doing this backwards. You would oftentimes be using the debugger to make sure that a executable is in fact working correctly once you've discovered a bug. In this case, we're just trying to aid this process a little bit so that you can understand how the debugger can help you if there was a problem. So first, we're going to make sure that there is, in fact, no problems for this example. Remember that we're sort of doing this backwards here. You would use the debugger to make sure your code is, in fact, working correctly. And so to begin with, what I want to do is I simply want to type in my /h, and we do get our help. We do probably need to take a second to update our help. But then what we also want to do is we want to call our debug underscore argv underscore 01. And at this point, you'll see that it does in fact work. Okay, so we're seeing the printout not only of our arguments from the for loop that is in main, but we also see that little table that we've created inside of our function. So far, everything looks like it works correctly. And so the only thing that we want to do now is we want to update our help. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to have the NetBeans setup, or setup NetBeans rather. And so this one right here is going to show our setup NetBeans. And then for the other switch, which is going to be our debug underscore argv underscore 01, I want to simply make a call to our function. So there we go. Our help is now updated. and everything appears to work correctly. So let's jump into debugging. Let's assume that something doesn't work correctly. And instead, what we want to do is simply track the progress through our executable. So in other words, track the steps that your executable executes, and line by line or step by step. Okay. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to come up to our main. And once again, somewhere in our main, we want to pick the first executable line of code where we think there's a problem. So for instance, let's see if our arguments are working correctly. Now, from the command line, we have complete control over that. So for instance, we can type in /h, it seems to work. We can type in /debug argv, it seems to work. We can even go so far as to type in NetBeans setup. Let's actually make sure if I've got that correct. It's actually setup NetBeans. That would have actually been a really good test there. And you see that this prompts us for our earlier example from our last video, which I'm going to briefly go through. So everything seems to be working correctly, but once again, let's assume that it's not. And so effectively, our triaging might be broken. So we're going to put a breakpoint right here. And we're going to assume then that this is the first line of code that still is running successfully. In other words, we want to check to see if our arguments are correct. And then what we want to do is we want to right click and we want to debug. And you'll see that my debugger stops on line 42. In other words, where I put the first breakpoint. We could have put a breakpoint earlier in our main, but essentially this part really hasn't changed any. And you'll see that it is now checking the arguments to see if they are in fact less than 2. And you notice here that our argument count is 1. And you can verify that by going to the variables tab, and you'll see that my argc is 1. And if that was not yet enough proof, you can also come to the expression evaluator and type in argc, and you'll see that it is 1. And so you know already what's going to happen from the earlier video, that I'm going to step into the first branch of the if statement, and I'm going to run my setup NetBeans. But that wasn't what we wanted to do. Effectively, we can't do anything else other than run this first branch of our if statement. Why is that? Well, it turns out we haven't provided any command line arguments. And if you see here, my code to print out all of the values in my argv essentially is telling us that we did not provide another argument. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and stop our debugger. Let's go back to our debug demo, to our properties, and once again to the run branch. And you'll notice that there is a list here for our line here for the run command. And there's a drop-down menu that allows for you to add command line arguments to our run command. And specifically, what you can do is you can do a space after this, and we're going to focus then on our debug underscore argv underscore 01. In other words, the same thing that we just ran from the command line, we can now run from the debugger by specifying the run command. Now, two things to note is, number one, do not delete the output path, because that essentially is where your executable is compiled to for the purposes of debugging. And secondly, what you're going to notice is that you can use this drop-down menu and essentially enter in different arguments. So if we go back to the other example where we're wanting to test our setup NetBeans, and what you can do then is you can build a little list of switches that you want to test, and then you can simply come in here and change which switch you want to test. So for right now, I mistyped my setup here. There we go. So for right now, we're interested in testing the debug underscore argv underscore 01. So we're going to select that. And we're going to hit apply. We're going to hit OK. And now when we right click and go to debug, we'll still stop at the exact same point here. But if you notice now, if I come down here to the expression evaluation, my argc is equal to 2. And more importantly, my argv square brackets 1 is now equal to the value of the switch that I wish to pass to my executable while it is debugging. In other words, now I can actually step past the first branch in the if statement, step again. I'm not even sure what I just hit. My apologies on that one. And step again. And you'll see that finally we get down here to this branch, and we can actually check to see whether or not this is going to evaluate by very carefully copying and pasting the code into our expression evaluator. And you'll see in this case, there's going to be 0 differences between the argv square brackets 1 and the switch that we are looking for. And so at this point, you would expect for our debugger to drop down into this branch of our if statement. And we step again, we jump into our function. We start to print out our nice little table. Tell you what, at this point, why don't we go ahead and see our nice little table as it's being printed out. So we'll go ahead and bring this over here. There we go. You can see there's our first line of our nice little table. And we are looping through then. Let's give it just a little more room here. And you'll step again. You'll see that there is my second argument, and there is my printf for the bottom of the table. And then before we leave this, let's take a second to explore these temporary variables, or these variables that are inside of our function. And specifically what we want to do is we want to check on our index variable, which is 2 now, but we can also check on the address of the index variable and the address and value of the results variable. So results, remember right now, has not yet been assigned. Once we step again, you'll see that it is equal to 2 because that's what our argc was equal to. You can also check the address of the results variable. You'll see that once again, my index and my results variable are fairly close in memory. In other words, the memory that was allocated to the function, these two variables sit close to each other in memory. But then what I'd also like to do is take a look at my argv. And specifically, you can see the address of my argv. But what I'd also like to do is take a look at the individual values in my argv. You'll see that there is the string associated with the 0th argument or the executable. My index equal to 1, which is the switch, or my debug argv underscore 1. But also what you can do is look at the individual characters in this array. So if I do argv square bracket 0, square bracket 0, I'm going to get the capital C. If I do square bracket 0, square brackets 1, I get the colon. Square bracket 0, square brackets 2, we'll get the slash. We'll talk about why this is presented like this later. It turns out that the slash character is going to be presented a little strange in the debugger. But you can also come over here to your variables window and you can do the same thing. You'll see there is your argv, and it points to the first character, or the capital letter C. Essentially, the address here is the address to that capital letter C. You can also do this where you can monitor a specific variable or a specific location of an array. And you'll see then that I can, let's see here one more time here, or all right, there we go. There we go. I'm not sure what happened there the first time, but there you go. There's our capital letter C. And we can continue to add watch variables as we go along. But let's go ahead and return then control back to our main. And I want to intentionally then leave this expression evaluation up as I return control back to our main. So now we're back out in main. We have our original index and our original results variable. And if you're very careful, you look at these addresses right here. There is our index variable from our function. And if I come along and I look at the address of the index variable in our main, this variable resides at a different location than this variable. And as such, the same thing is true with the address of my results in my main and my results variable in my helper function. And so this just further emphasizes the idea of scope or lifespan of a variable. And in this particular case, you'll see that the variables inside of our little helper function have a completely different memory address, even though they share the same name as the variables outside in our main. We're going to take a deeper look at this when we start looking at pointers and how to pass information by value and by reference or by address. That's as far as we want to go with that in this particular video. The whole purpose of this video is to focus on the importance of understanding the debugger. You can only imagine how many printf statements would be needed in your code to accomplish something like this. Doesn't mean that the printf statements aren't useful. It's just that they need to be used in conjunction with debugging. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and step out of my if statement. I'm going to step out of my main and then finish with the debugging of my code, which brings us back to the final little tweak that we need to make to our code. Now that we know how to correctly pass command line arguments, we no longer have to hard code the behavior of testing our setup underscore deadbeats. In other words, we can remove this from the first branch of the if statement. We can re-enable our implicit call to help, and now we should be able to test that we can, in fact, debug our setup NetBeans using a switch in our properties from our debug demo. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here. I'm going to use the correctly named one. As you can imagine, this one's just to jump over that particular branch in the if statement because it doesn't match perfectly. So I'm going to use the correctly named switch. I'm going to hit apply, okay, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to debug. And sure enough, if I come down here, my argc is going to be 2. You'll see that I'm already printing out on the console what was in this for loop right here. And at this point, then what I can simply do is step. I guess probably one of the other things we ought to do is go ahead and check to see what our argv square brackets 1 is. You'll see that it is, in fact, our setup underscore netbeans. We'll step again. We expect to see a match. Sure enough, we do. We fall down into this branch of the if statement. We step again, and at this point, we are now inside of our setup netbeans function. We earlier had a breakpoint at the beginning of our for loop. We're actually going to leave this here because at this point, we're sure that this part of the code runs correctly. So we'll just hit continue, which then allows for us to use this code interactively or use this function interactively. If you recall from the earlier video, we're simply going to provide it with a couple of positive integer values. We can still test to see how this works. It warns you if you don't enter in positive value. In this case, I'm just going to put in 123, 234 for the second value, and 345 for the third value. It now returns control back to the debugger. You'll see the green arrow next to the red square. And at this point, we can either step through our for loop if we were questioning that code, or we can simply hit continue. And at this point, continue will take us out of our function back to our main. And because there were no future or no later breakpoints, and there was no more code left to be run, then it simply ran through, returned exit success, and was done executing, and it closed our debug window. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.